All right, folks, welcome back to Mike and Maurice's Mind Escape. We have part two here. We're back with author of Prehistory Decoded, Martin Sweatman.
Hi
What's going
guys.
on, Mark? So, where we left off before we had a little bit of a technical difficulty was we were talking about the Sphinx and roughly how old it was, and we were discussing the Sphinx temple and the possible age. And you were saying you think the age is probably 7,000 BC, based on um, the constellation alignments.
That's right. So, yeah, in our zodiac, our ancient zodiac, um, the feline represents Cancer, not Leo. We know it as Leo, but that's because of some change that happened much later, probably. So, if you take it to be Cancer, then you get a date of 6.5 to 7,000 BC, which agrees with Robert Schoch's original weathering estimate. And then, of course, there's this thermoluminescence measurements of the granite blocks from the Sphinx temple. So everything's lining up, pointing towards a much older Sphinx, and I think it was built in the sort of period just before what's known as the 8.2 kiloyear event, which I suggest is another very destructive episode, a bit like the Younger Dryas impact, but perhaps not quite as extreme. And there is good evidence actually that there was another destructive episode at that time. So this 8.2 kiloyear event is another climate event. It's the strongest climate event in the Holocene. At the same time, we have an event known as the Storegga Slide in the North Sea. So this was a massive slump of the oceanic shelf, so that this 1,000 cubic miles, they say, of this oceanic shelf fell into the abyss, creating a massive tsunami. And according to the best radiocarbon dating evidence there is, it happens at the same time as there is this 8.2 kiloyear event in terms of climate. So we've got this climate event and this massive, the largest known undersea landslide, basically, happening all simultaneously within the dating evidence that we have. And then we also have something called the Black Sea deluge hypothesis. So this is where the Black Sea is thought to have catastrophically flooded at about the same time. We find also there is the eastern flank of Mount Etna in Sicily collapses at about the same time, producing a tsunami, which they found evidence for along the coast of Israel. So lots of these catastrophic events. Now, catastrophic events happen, they do happen. It's just that these happen all at about the same time, at about the time that we're traveling through the Taurid meteor stream, and at about the time that the Sphinx, or the end, the Sphinx may have been constructed. So
What
there are
was
lots of
do
yeah.
you have or do they have an idea of what Egypt looked like um, during and post Younger Dryas? Like what kind of effect it had on the landscape?
Yeah, it's a strange thing, you see, because there is archaeological evidence from the Nile Valley, sorry, in Egypt, from around the time of the Younger Dryas impact, or maybe just slightly after. And the people then were a bit like the Natufian. They were kind of hunter-gatherers, from what we can see. So they were not advanced at all, like the later dynastic Egyptians. So we have, so at around 9,000 BC, we have this hunter-gatherer population in the Egyptian Nile. And then there is a blank for 3,000 years. There seems to be nothing, practically nothing at all.
Right.
In my book, I call it an archaeological black hole. There's nothing at all until you get to about just after 6,000 BC. And then the archaeological evidence starts to build up again. We start to see the very beginning of, again, sort of basic living along the Nile in huts and so on. And we see the gradual development of Egypt up towards the a dynastic period. So we've got this 3,000 year hiatus in occupation along the Egyptian Nile between 9,000 and 6,000 BC. And it has no explanation. Well, it has some explanations, but I'll tell you what the archaeologists are saying, I think, at the moment is that that can be explained by an event known as the Wild Nile. So they say that at some point the Nile flooded extremely high and it washed away what kind of primitive people there were, perhaps, at that time. Okay, so that could explain that, but it could also be that, as I say that in the book, that there was this much greater event, this 8.2 kiloyear event, which perhaps there was a mega tsunami or something, which actually washed away a much more advanced ancient Egyptian civilization than we currently know about. And that would explain this 3,000 year sort of archaeological black hole. Mm-hmm. It was just wiped away.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to happen throughout human. Even if you look at on a more micro scale, what we know is the Dark Ages and medieval times. You know, it's like, yeah, there's some stuff, but there's not a lot. You know, and that's why they call it the Dark Ages. So throughout human history, for whatever reason, whether it's the plague or an astronomical event, we seem to obviously other things take precedent, like surviving. So, do you believe that a lot of these people took refuge in, you know, like Darren Kuyu and like you were mentioning, you know, the Turkey region before? There's a lot of the cave systems around there. Do you believe these people, you know, took refuge there, or what do you think was happening?
I honestly don't know. It's not something I've really looked into. So all I could say is perhaps I don't know the ages of those cave systems. I don't know if anyone really does. It's feasible, perhaps. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting idea, and scientific questions have to start somewhere. You know, you have to start with an idea, with a hypothesis, and then you have to go and find the evidence. So I think, as a suggestion, yeah, perhaps, but we need more evidence, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's important that you say that too, because it's like we all want to speculate. I mean, that's what we do on this podcast. We just speculate. We throw stuff at the wall, see what sticks, and we include a lot of different ideas and theories and hypotheses. But when you look at it, a lot of these things that were considered crazy 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago are now coming to the forefront. You know, it's not even just, you know, it's you look at a Graham Hancock and a John Anthony West, but then you see all these other things popping up and things that are being proven right. You know, like Gobekli Tepe was impossible until they found it. So where I do think you're right, we do need to look at these sites from a scientific lens. The fact that there could be other Gobekli Tepes, or the fact that there could be new finds, I think is very exciting. And I think that's why you do see a lot of this topic out there, you know, whether it's YouTube or, you know, on TV or whatever. So,
yeah, I mean, as a physicist, I completely agree with you. As a physicist, it kind of surprises me that the mainstream archaeologists are often so sure about themselves. I mean, they'll probably say, "Oh, we're not so sure," and yet they come across as being extremely sure about what they think they know.
Right.
But as a physicist, you know, as a scientist, yeah, I think you have to be much more cautious than that. I think you have to, you know, all theories start as an idea, and it might sound pretty ridiculous when you first consider it, but then you go and find the evidence, and the evidence, sometimes there isn't any evidence and it was a crazy idea, end of story. Sometimes the evidence is there and you find it and it backs up what your hypothesis, and it keeps on going, and all of these really good ideas at some point have started out as a crazy idea.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, even look at Galileo, Copernicus, you know, Giordano Bruno. These people were, you know, villainized for their views. But I think the other thing to think about too is like what you're saying. You're an actual physicist saying, yes, we need to be more open-minded. I think that's lost. We had another physicist on who wrote a book called Losing the Nobel Prize, Brian Keating, and he was saying similar things, like, you know, this idea that just because you're a scientist, you can't have human or cognitive bias is absurd. It's just something that comes with human nature. And I think if you can accept that, you know, there can be a conversation, but it seems like so many these people are sure of themselves. And to be honest, I don't even think most Egyptologists have geology background. I know like Robert Schoch does, and that's why he probably catches a little bit of a guff because he's got an actual scientific background, whereas a lot of these people have art history major, um, anthropology. Some of these things are not as concise.
Yeah, I mean, that's something I was really keen on when I was writing my book, was to make sure it was it showed how the scientific method works. It showed that as scientists, we don't know everything absolutely, that empirical science is actually based on the statistical analysis of data. And without that, all you're doing is guessing, really. And I think a lot of what the archaeologists and historians are doing, well, particularly if you go back into prehistory, a lot of what they're doing is guesswork. And it would be nice if they perhaps admitted that a bit more,
Right.
rather than being so determined that they're right. So yeah, I think as a physicist, it surprises me that when you don't have the scientific statistical evidence, that archaeologists can still be quite so sure about themselves.
Yeah, I mean, we always say like we are living, breathing magic. Just to think about the fact that what you are, what I am, the fact that we're having a conversation through a computer, right now is just the most nuts thing. And the fact that more people just go about their day and don't even think about where we come from, what we are, what we're doing here. Is there a purpose? Is there not like that's the stuff that we're constantly confronted with. That's why we talk about this stuff on our show, because people just go through their day blindly. Oh, I read it in a book. Oh, this is what ancient Egypt was 2,500 50 years ago, or BC, and that's set in stone. There's don't
Yeah,
question that.
that's the date that comes up. I was typing it up, and yeah, 2,500 BC is apparently the fact. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't
I
know.
mean, there's a kind of a scientific, there's a historical, there's a history of science story here as well. Try and get my words out. So, I mean, you can trace back, what we're really talking about here is an argument about catastrophism, whether there have been or have not been great catastrophes, cosmic catastrophes, on the timescale of human development.
Right.
And that argument goes back thousands of years. You can take it all the way back to Plato, probably before Plato, but I certainly know I can go back as far as Plato. So Plato talks, I mean, you mentioned it earlier about Atlantis. I don't know about Atlantis,
The
but he does talk
Timaeus and
about,
the Critaeus.
exactly, but he does talk about the Phaeton myth, which is this myth of the son of the sun,
Right.
sort of riding his chariot, losing control of his chariot, and burning up the earth and so on. And in the same, almost in the same paragraph, it goes on to say that has the tone of a myth, but actually it's a real event, and these events are caused by basically bodies in space that revolve around, in the sky and so on. And every long interval of time, I think is how it's described, we get bombarded with these things from the heavens or from space. And that is an absolutely perfect description of Kluber Napier's coherent catastrophism. It's precise. So it's amazing to think that even in Plato's time, they must have known about this. You couldn't make that up if that hadn't have happened, because it's such an accurate description of coherent catastrophism.
I mean, the ancient Greeks, they for some of the stuff, they obviously could have been using myth. Myth back then was basically an explanation for things they can't explain, whether it's scientific related, or I guess some of it could be made up. I mean, we're human beings, we all have imaginations, but I can't put myself in the mind of somebody back then, so all I can do is speculate. But in terms of back then, obviously there wasn't even science. So, you look at myth, yeah, Atlantis, there could have been an advanced civilization. Is it as exaggerated as what people make it out to be, with spaceships and energy systems and the great pyramids shooting lasers up in the sky? Probably not. But there could have been a seafaring people that got around the whole globe somehow that we just are not aware of, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly fair, perfectly reasonable. And I think if there was, it was probably this civilization just before the 8.2 kiloyear event, perhaps it was them that managed to create a global network, or maybe not the entire globe, but a seafaring civilization.
Well, I mean, I know too. There's been like Thor Heyerdahl. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he made it to Easter Island from the coast of Chile using just native, trees, rope from vegetation and all that kind of stuff. So if somebody can make a raft, there's no doubt in my mind that the possibility of making boats back then, was high. So
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we know that they were able to make bone flutes many tens of thousands of years ago. Now, if you can make a bone flute, you can make a raft.
Sure, yeah,
Obvious.
absolutely.
And they were good astronomers, so they could navigate. So what more do you need?
I think most people before the Younger Dryas there was a lot more land bridges too, wasn't there? There was Sundaland and Dodgerland, and I mean at one point Europe was connected to, or the UK was connected to the rest of Europe.
Absolutely, yeah, you're right. So there was Sundaland. However, there was still a deep, what do we call it, ocean passage between
right, yeah,
South Sundaland and Australia.
Right.
So there is still this strange case of how did the original Australians, how did they get there? But if you say that they were seafaring, there's no reason why they couldn't have been.
I think I've seen something that they pushed their timeline back to 40,000-50,000 years ago as far as native Australians. They could have came there even before that, previous to some other event happening.
So if you can build a raft and you can navigate with the stars, then it becomes quite reasonable that you get to Australia.
So with the archaeoastronomy side of things with Gobekli Tepe, when you started doing the work, was it you just kept making correlations, or was it something that came naturally just from having kind of a template, or how did that work?
I guess there's a connection with my actual research here, my sort of professional research. So my professional research is in an area called statistical mechanics. And what that entails is understanding the statistics of arrangements of atoms and molecules and how that relates to states of matter like solid and liquid and gas and so on. Mm-hmm. So in any case, I'm basically trained in statistically analyzing arrangements of objects in space. When I say in space, I don't mean outer space. I mean, in 3D. And I suspect that had something to do with me seeing that I could analyze the pillar 43 in basically the same way. It's the same kind of maths, analyzing that pillar, how the different animal symbols are arranged. What's the chance of that happening purely by chance when you compare with the constellations? So I suspect that probably helped me come up with the sort of scientific statistical method.
Do you think... I'm sorry. Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's pretty interesting.
Completely out of...
Watch out.
Do you think that when you look at what you've done and everything and compare it, have you had anybody take a look at it, like any, not necessarily peer reviewed, because I know, your background is actually physics. You would probably have your stuff peer reviewed there, but in terms of, have you had anybody look at your book and give you notes on any ideas about it, or is it something you feel comfortable with as is?
So the Gobekli Tepe paper that was peer reviewed, published in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry. So that was peer reviewed. Our follow-up paper about the European Paleolithic cave art, again, that was published in the Athens Journal of History. So that was peer reviewed as well. Now, the book, it's a general science book, so it's not going to get peer reviewed, and it's only been out a couple of months. So far, the reviews that readers have posted on Amazon and so forth are really encouraging. They're really good. They're really good. So I'm very happy with that. In terms of academic sort of critique of my book, there hasn't been any as far as I know yet. So we'll see about that.
I was just curious because there's always a bunch, when it comes to this kind of a topic, even though your main subject is hard science and you're taking a hard science approach to it, there's always going to be these trolls that come out of the woodwork. Oh, it couldn't possibly. Oh, we know all about that. It was hunter gatherers and there was nothing special about them and they just built stuff together. So it's that rhetoric that I think you'll hear from probably, and I haven't read your book yet, but I just knowing that you're correlating things together, people don't like that for whatever reason. I don't know why that is, but just to think that people back then had the intelligence to do something like that seems to be taboo. So
yeah, no one as yet. There hasn't been. So our Fox paper. So this was the Gobekli Tepe paper. The site's archaeologists wrote a rebuttal in the same journal, and we responded to that rebuttal.
Sure.
I think pretty adequately. So there was that response. Yeah. Now you might imagine that the site's archaeologists would provide some kind of rebuttal because they're meant to be, well, they are the experts at the site. Right. So how can this other person tell us anything about it?
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Paleolithic cave art paper. There hasn't been any rebuttal to that, not yet, anyway. So as things stand, as they are, it stands. At the moment, it's unchallenged, and part of the reason I suspect for that is because it is a proper statistical scientific study. And as far as I'm concerned, the statistical methods are robust. They are. It's an ironclad case as far as I'm concerned. So, if someone wants to produce a rebuttal, I'd be very happy to answer any criticisms. It's the way that science works. There's always this toing and froing from different quarters. So, hopefully someone will write something about it.
Well, I think it's important too. I mean, because it doesn't always have to be negative too. Somebody could have like, oh, I have a theory about this too, and this is what I think, and it could lead to even more of your own discovery. That's why I like doing this podcast, because even when I have a preconceived notion about, like, let's say what we're talking about, Gobekli Tepe, I'll learn a bunch of new stuff, and then it changes my viewpoint on what I already know and how I'm going to approach it going forward. So obviously that's an important part of the process. But do you think that I wanted to go back to the Falcon pillar, if we're going to call it that, going forward?
Yeah. Okay.
The handbags on the top. Now, I know I say handbags, but that's only because there's other sites throughout the world, whether it's ancient Mayan, there's Aboriginal, Caso rock art in California. I mean, there's a ton of places that have depictions, whether it's the Apkallu of ancient Assyria holding these bags, with one of them's got a pine cone in one hand and one's got the bag in the other hand. What do you think's going on there? Because those are the same things that are featured at the top of that pillar. Now, I think you said something about the sunset or the horizon or something, but why is it in sections, like 3 like that? And why, and in other depictions and other civilizations, do you believe that they're holding this thing?
Well, I mean, so first of all, on pillar 43 at Gobekli Tepe, it's in 3 sections because there are, after the summer solstice, you've got 3 left. You've got the winter solstice and the 2 equinoxes, so that's why there's 3.
Okay.
Now, I have no idea whether there's any kind of relationship between those handbags and later handbags that you find around the world. There might be. Okay. I have no idea. It's curious.
It looks exactly the only reason why. I mean, there's no. Similar. I think anybody with a keen eye can look at that thing and be like, "This looks similar." It's weird. I mean, and I haven't been able to find an academic reasoning for it. It's always, obviously the alien people are saying it's the apparatus that you carry as an astronaut when you're going on to because it does look like that too. But obviously they probably didn't have that technology back then. But I find it curious that all these ancient civilizations do depict this thing, and it could just mean that they were carrying or traveling or on the move. I mean, who knows? But I just find it curious that it is pictured in a lot of these ancient sites, which are important, and nobody talks about it. So,
Yeah, I mean, the answer is I don't know. However, I will speculate, and it's okay to speculate because as scientists,
sure,
this is
that's
where
what,
All we do.
this is where
that's all we.
ideas start. So in my book, I suggest that there is this common astromythology which goes back maybe 40,000 years, and that timescale is no accident. By the way, I suggest that there is a reason for that timescale, which I can talk about if you want. But anyway, so I suggest that there is some kind of common astromythology to the Americas that sort of links the Americas and Eurasia. And so my suggestion there is actually based on Michael Witzel's works. Now, Michael Witzel is Harvard professor of Sanskrit, and he wrote a book a few years ago, 2013, I think it was, Origins of the World's Mythologies. And that 40,000 years is his timescale. So he suggested that there was a linked mythology over 40,000 years between the New World and the Old. And basically, I agree with him. And I'm suggesting it's an astro-mythology based on astronomy and constellations and so on, and comets. So we have this 40,000 year timescale. That would allow these kinds of symbols to distribute, to sort of diffuse around the world. Now we see at Gobekli Tepe this symbol, which I'm pretty sure is actually a sunset.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll pull it up
so
again.
Could that be related to handbags somewhere else, in the Americas? Well, I mean, it's not, it's possible. Perhaps if there is a link, perhaps what those handbags mean is the person carrying this handbag is an astronomer. Perhaps it's as simple as that. It's an astronomer priest, or it could be some kind of deity linked to astronomy.
I mean, I haven't heard that that take on it, so I definitely think that that's plausible for sure. That could be the case. I've also heard. I mean, I think the one that I found kind of interesting, which I don't think has any basis, but I do see the connection, is a lot of the arches with the thing are similar to what the main hall looks like in a Masonic lodge, and that the arch could be part of some sort of early Masonic symbolism.
Yeah, perhaps. Again, it's not a subject I know anything about, but I suspect symbolism has sort of dispersed and gradually changed and morphed, and it gets represented in lots of different ways in different places. So, all these things are possible.
I know Graham Hancock speculates that they were carrying psychedelics in there, which, I mean, that would be kind of a whole different ball game compared to kind of what you're talking about. But, that's obviously, psychedelics have been used all over the world as well. But when you look at all the way the relief cuttings and the way that these were carved out, what kind of, I guess, level of sophistication do you think these people were at compared to, do you think they were closer to, like our early, Homo sapien days, or do you think they're closer to modern humans? Like, would we identify with these people that built Gobekli Tepe?
Wow. It's so hard to say. I mean, when you have comes along and sort of wipes out your way of living, what do you do? There's this new religion that develops, and so that's getting people together, it's getting people to cooperate. Is that enough now? Do you sort of develop these new skills as a way to sort of express your new religion? Yeah, I think it's possible. So I can easily see that what we're seeing at Gobekli Tepe is just a phase of development after the Younger Dryas period. It's kind of catalyzed by the Younger Dryas event, bringing people together. They're sharing their knowledge, sharing their skills, they're supporting each other, and it gives them the opportunity to develop new skills, like this masonry. Having said that, I suspect that some of these skills are already there. So, like I say, the Natufian, they weren't too far off being able to do this kind of thing based on present evidence. And as you've said before, archaeologists are discovering new things all the time. They barely scratch the surface of the earth. There could be all sorts of discoveries out there which kind of link together that make it all make sense. And I mean, I suspect that actually when the archaeologists get around to excavating the rest of Gobekli Tepe, because it's only been about 5 or 10% excavated, that we'll find a lot more clues in the remaining parts of Gobekli Tepe, which kind of makes sense and piece it all together.
Yeah, I know there's some interesting stuff, specifically that totem pole with the top 2 heads, which have been, I don't know, broken off or chiseled off, but there's some interesting symbology on there for sure. When you assess, though, this timeline, do you think that we will ever get a specific time, a more specific timeline in terms of this was Gobekli Tepe, this was pre-dynastic Egypt? Do you think we'll continue to fill in these blanks, or do you think that it'll always be blank because we can't fathom what was happening that far back?
Yeah, it's a real problem, I think, because you have these disasters. Some of the evidence is going to be lost. It's going to be washed away or burned up. It's going to be destroyed, covered over. So I think it's always going to be difficult to fill in the gaps completely. But and this comes back to one of the earlier things we were talking about, is that the reason why I think there is so much resistance to this kind of idea in, I would say, conventional archaeological circles comes back to this history of science. So you go back to Plato, and there was this big argument he had with Aristotle about whether there were these catastrophes or not. And then you move on 1,500 years and you get to the sort of scientific renaissance, the resurgence of science in Europe. And it's the same arguments again. We've been having these arguments about whether there are catastrophes or not all this way through. And then you get to about 200 years ago, and suddenly there was this new paradigm in geology called uniformitarianism, or gradualism, as it's also known. And we've been stuck with that kind of paradigm for the last 200 years, more or less, which says that there have been no cosmic events of this kind, that the Earth is basically pretty safe from space. And that's been the prevailing way of thinking for 200 years, going back to these they're known as the sort of fathers of geology. So it's very difficult to break down this way of thinking, which is permeated through pretty much all of academia. The whole of academia has built up its ideas on this principle, this geological principle of uniformitarianism or gradualism. So to challenge that is really difficult. And that's why people like Graham Hancock and so on have found so much resistance, is because have been saying completely the opposite. So, it's going to take a lot of evidence to change, to make such a massive change. But I think we're seeing it come through. You've got the Younger Dryas impact, absolutely clear, it happened. The evidence is there, it's in the ground, people have found it. You've got craters, whether those craters are related to, we don't know, but the craters are at least telling us, hey, impacts on Earth happen.
They have micro diamonds and microspherules and all that kind of stuff too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, again, something I summarize in my book. I've been through all the papers on the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis pretty carefully. And for me, it's absolutely clear they have got all the evidence they need. I'm convinced that they are right on this, and that the opponents to the hypothesis, they've made so many mistakes. Some of the work they've done is really not that good. Basic mistakes. So when you compare the two sides, it's obvious what's going on. It's people trying to protect this 200-year-old paradigm. Actually, they're not doing a great job. I
What
think
is
Doesn't make
John?
any sense.
Yeah, John Anthony was. What does he call it? The Church of Progress or something along those lines.
Hey,
yeah. So it's the way that science goes, but you have these changes in thinking that suddenly there's this reversal from one way of thinking to another. And this is another example, but it's a really, really big example because we've got
Sure.
this 200-year, at least 200-year backstory of gradualism that we have to try and confront and overturn. So we're going to need loads and loads of evidence. But I think we're getting there.
oh yeah.
You've got the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. You've got places like Gobekli Tepe. You've got Kluber and Napier's coherent catastrophism. It all points in exactly the same direction.
Absolutely. Even I think Hamlet's Mill is good for all the flood myths and all that as well. Do you think that we're due not to be not to be dire or sound down, but do you think that we're maybe um, Icarus style flying a little too close to the sun with the way we approach things with this? Oh, it's fine. We live on Earth. Well, the scientists will
Save
detect
us.
something, and when the torrid patch comes around, we could be up.
Well, when is that coming again? Tomorrow?
Well, I hope not. No, I think from my understanding, and I'm not one of the expert astronomers, but my understanding is that the next episode the next time that we will go through the core of the Taurid meteor stream is around about 3000 AD, more or less, give or take a few hundred years.
Perfect.
So we've got another 1,000 years, plus or minus a few hundred, to get ready. And in any case, it could be a damp squib. The Taurid meteor stream is constantly decaying, so that the large objects that are there are gradually fragmenting, getting smaller. And so by the time we reach 3000 AD, maybe there's not going to be much left. We can hope.
Yeah, maybe we already absorbed a lot of it. If we've gone through that cycle a whole bunch, maybe us and some of our closest planets have already seen some of those impacts.
Yeah. So what happens is these asteroids, these sort of fragments of comets, they decay, and they turn into what we can see in the night sky as the zodiacal dust cloud. Okay. And it's known that this zodiacal dust cloud is actually pretty heavy. There's a lot of it. If you were to take all of the dust in the inner solar system that's counted as part of this zodiacal dust cloud, add it all up and sort of pack it back into a ball, you'll get a comet which is about 35 kilometers in diameter, which is much larger than any comet in the inner solar system we know about.
Wow.
So we know that on the time scale of a few tens of thousands of years, there was a giant comet in the inner solar system. The evidence is there. Basically, we can think of the zodiacal dust cloud as kind of like the fossilized remains of this ancient comet.
It's crazy.
So now how much of it's left? This is the thing. We don't know. It seems as though, particularly over the Holocene period, the last 10,000 years, that our interactions with the Taurid meteor stream have been getting weaker, which is good news. But, I think we need to spend a lot more money on researching this Taurid meteor stream. It's obvious, it makes sense. It's the biggest cosmic threat to us. It's a bigger threat than all of the other asteroids that we know about in the inner solar system. So we should be focusing on that, I think.
That's
but
crazy.
We're not.
Yeah,
but we're not.
No, I mean,
because
that's obviously, I think that's the biggest threat to humanity. I mean, besides maybe, I don't know, AI in 1,000 years if we let it go crazy, but I think we're like you said, we're preparing. I mean, I've heard ideas, cast a big net, blow the thing up, knock it off its core, slowly knock it off. I've actually heard this, and I don't know if you've looked into this, but they've been trying to use light, like light streams or light particles to push the comet or the asteroid away. Something about how the dark side, like it's got obviously a dark side when it rotates or something like along those lines, and by constantly blasting light at it would push it off its course or something along those lines.
Yeah, no, you see, there's a difference between how you might deal with asteroids and how you might deal with comets, because asteroids are solid, pretty well packed objects. Okay, so you might be able to nudge them off course or blow them up or whatever.
Right.
But if you've got a fragmented comet swarm, you're kind of stuck. You know, you might be able to move one piece, but then you've got another 1,000 pieces that get past you. So, well, what can you do with a swarm of comet debris? It's a very tricky one, and I suspect that this is part of the reason why, particularly people perhaps at NASA and sort of more sort of the sort of authority on these issues of, you know, cosmic impacts.
Sure.
That they don't really, or they haven't been that keen to look at this problem because they know it's a very difficult problem to deal with. What can you do with comets? If you try and blow them up, they fragment and you still get all the fragments that come at you. So,
right.
In a sense, I think they've tried to make this problem go away.
But you think asteroids a different story? You think we could deal with an asteroid?
Well, I think it's easier than a fragmented comet swarm.
You've seen the movie. You've seen Armageddon. It's not a problem.
Yeah, and I know they've actually been discussing possibly mining asteroids, you know, because they have, like, I was reading this one, one of them's got more titanium than the planet Earth or something along those lines. There's some of these asteroids have more precious, you know, minerals on them than we have on our entire planet. So I think that's been discussed. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting topic.
Easy.
I know when we go camping every year in northern Michigan, I think it's the second week in August, we catch there's the Taurid meteor shower you can see up in the sky, and you just see them blasting off every couple minutes. It's actually fascinating. It's beautiful too. You know, I live outside Chicago. We get a red glow out here, so anytime I can get up to the woods and get away from the light, it's always fun.
Yeah. Now, see, at the moment, we don't pass through a particularly dense part of the Taurid meteor stream. We're relatively free of it for the moment. But I mean, what you're seeing, there will come a time, you know, in 1,000 years' time, where what you're seeing will be presumably much more intense. Many more bigger fragments, very spectacular. And there's a suggestion, I think Kluber and Napier have suggested this before, that this is kind of related to Halloween, the Halloween fireballs. So there's that kind of aspect of the sort of mythological background as well. But
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So just to wrap it up here and go back to Gobekli Tepe for a minute, are you going to do a follow-up book, or was this your masterpiece, or what do you plan on doing with this in the future in terms of your research? And do you think that there's more to be discovered along the lines that you've already kind of set out there, or what's your...
Absolutely. I don't know whether it'll come to another book. I think we'll just have to see how it goes, what evidence turns up. But what I'm doing at the moment is I'm blogging. Anything I find out, I'm blogging it. So, you know, if people are interested in this, I encourage them to come and read my blog, martinsweatman.blogspot.com.
Yeah, we'll add it to. We'll put the link in the description. We'll put the link to your book on Amazon as well.
Yeah. Until if I have a very scientific case like I did for Gobekli Tepe or for the European cave art, then I'd rather publish that, so, you know, to have it properly peer reviewed and published in a journal. But for the other stuff where you can't really make a scientific case, or it's more speculative, but the links are there.
Sure.
For that kind of work, I'll basically be blogging that information on my blog. So
cool.
The last month or so, I've been digging into ancient Egypt and the prehistory of Egypt. So I've got a few blogs about that. I'm starting to look at Sumeria, the ancient civilization of Sumer.
Sure.
Right now, and again, see all the same things there. So there'll be plenty to come out about that as well.
Yeah, for information on those, I don't know if you've ever read, but I think it's called the Great Courses, and they usually it's like a lecture, but it's like one teacher going through the whole thing of it. I think I listened to the Bob Breer one on ancient Egypt, and there's one on ancient Sumeria too, which is fascinating. But yeah, thanks for coming on. I'm going to order your book. It sounds fascinating. Everybody should check it out. We're going to add the link to the description. Prehistory Decoded. And we're going to get you back on because I do want to talk about physics and theoretical physics and all that kind of stuff because that's one of our other
that's cool.
Our other subjects on here. But thanks for coming on. It's been fascinating. Is there anything else you want to put out there?
Thank you for having me on. It's been great. I know there's a lot of questions that I've actually gone off topic. I've kind of gone sideways from what you asked me originally. So I'll be happy to come back and
we do that sometimes.
You never know where we're going to go.
We got I got so many things boiling up top that sometimes it gets lost in translation. But it was a fun conversation, and I learned a lot. And like I said, I'm going to check your book out, and I like the background behind it and what you're trying to do with it. So I think
it seems like you got your ducks in a row for sure.
Yeah. So
okay, thanks, guys.
Yeah, we appreciate your work. Thanks for coming on, and we'll get you back on in the future.
Cheers. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Peace.
Have a good one.
See ya.